Look closely, not at the New York skyline everyone posts on postcards, but at the shadows behind it. Those razor-thin towers stretching above Manhattan, silent spires stabbing into the clouds. They look like symbols of success, don't they? But what if I told you that these glittering giants are almost completely empty? What if I told you that behind those million-dollar windows, there are no families, no laughter, no lights, just darkness? And what if the truth is this? These towers weren't built for people. They were built for money. Hidden loopholes, secret zoning deals, engineering that should have been impossible, and fortunes so large they needed a place to hide. Tonight, we're going deep into the story New York never wanted you to hear. The real reason these towers rise like ghosts above Central Park, why so many remain unlit, and how a century-old legal trick allowed billionaires to buy pieces of the sky, while the city beneath them changed forever. This is the untold, uncomfortable, unbelievable truth of Billionaires Row. Before these towers carved their way into the clouds, before the world argued about their shadows, before the lawsuits, the engineering miracles, the scandals, the whispers of corruption, there was something much simpler. A question. A question whispered in the back rooms of real estate firms, circulated among lawyers who understood the fine print, and murmured by billionaires searching for the safest place on earth to store a fortune. What if we could buy a piece of the sky? Not land, not homes, not communities, the sky. Because the sky couldn't be touched, the sky couldn't be taxed. The sky couldn't be lost in a war, a market crash, or a political meltdown. And so, long before concrete was poured or steel was welded, long before cranes pierced Manhattan's horizon, a silent race began. A race to discover how high money could climb. My name doesn't matter. There's no face behind this voice. Only the truth you're about to hear. A truth buried under decades of zoning law, hidden negotiations, and towers that glisten like trophies while hiding everything they really stand for. Because this is not just the story of a street. Not just the story of a skyline, not even the story of billionaires. This is the story of a loophole so powerful, a market so hungry, and an ambition so unstoppable that it reshaped a city without ever asking permission. And once you understand how these towers truly came to be, you'll never look at New York the same way again. To understand Billionaires Row, you have to strip away the glossy real estate ads, the magazine spreads, and the breathless headlines about record-breaking penthouses. You have to forget the glamour, forget the glistening glass, forget the idea that this place was ever built for people. Because at its core, Billionaires Row wasn't born from demand. It wasn't shaped by community needs. It wasn't even inspired by architectural ambition. It was shaped by something far colder, far quieter, and far more powerful. Capital, money looking for a safe place to hide. Let's rewind the clock. Manhattan, early 2000s. It was a simple, unremarkable stretch of mid-rise buildings, hotels from the 1960s, aging offices, tired brick facades, and blinking neon signs that belonged to a different era. Tourists wandered in and out of shops. Taxi horns blended with the usual midtown chaos. Joggers rushed into the park. Nothing about it suggested a future where towers would rise like needles challenging gravity itself. But beneath the surface of normalcy, something was happening. A shift in global wealth, a movement of money unlike anything cities had seen before. Hedge fund billionaires, foreign tycoons, political elites from unstable countries. They were all searching for the same thing, a safe, stable, unshakable place to put their fortunes. Not gold, not stocks, not companies, real estate. And not just any real estate. Manhattan real estate, especially real estate with an unblocked view of the most precious piece of land in America, Central Park. Developers noticed. They watched money move like tides, flowing out of collapsing economies, fleeing political crackdowns, escaping sanctions, searching desperately for stability. And to them, a dangerous idea began to take shape. If the world's richest people want a home for their money, why not build them one that floats above the clouds? But here's the twist. Locals didn't ask for these towers. The city didn't need them. New Yorkers weren't begging for penthouses. This entire skyline was engineered, piece by piece, loophole by loophole, until a new economic experiment rose above the park. Developers quietly bought small buildings no one cared about, not because the buildings were valuable, but because the air above them was. Air rights, invisible, untouched, worth more than the land they floated above. And as developers collected these air rights, as they assembled tiny plots into massive zoning puzzles, they unlocked something extraordinary, the ability to build higher than anyone thought possible. Not wide, not beautiful, not practical, just high. High enough to break price records, high enough to reach buyers across oceans, high enough to tower over Central Park like vertical trophies. It was no longer about architecture, no longer about community, no longer about New York. It was about altitude and the global wealth that chased it. And once the first tower sold a penthouse for over 100 million, the race was on. Towers didn't just rise, they multiplied. 432 Park Avenue, 1111111157th Street, Central Park Tower, 107, each one taller, thinner, more audacious, more impossible. Thinner, more audacious, more impossible. A skyline sculpted not by architects, but by ambition, by loopholes, by lawyers, by money, and in the blink of a decade, New York's most familiar view became something unrecognizable. A battlefield of glass and steel, built for people who would almost never live there. To understand how Billionaires Row was even possible, you have to go back, not years, but an entire century into New York's past, to a tiny legal detail that developers eventually turned into one of the most powerful real estate tricks in the world. It starts with something you can't see, something you can't touch, something that floats above every building in New York City. And believe it or not, that empty, invisible space is what built the most controversial skyscrapers in modern history. 100 years ago, in 1916, New York created zoning laws to stop early skyscrapers from drowning the streets in cold gray shadow. They made rules about how tall buildings could be, how thick they could be, how they had to step back as they reached toward the sky. These rules were designed to protect sunlight, not to create a playground for billionaires. Decades later, in 1961, the city updated the rules again and introduced something called a floor area ratio, a mathematical limit on how much space a building could have based on the size of the land it sat on. The logic was simple. A small piece of land meant a small building. A large piece of land allowed a larger structure. Straightforward. Predictable. But hidden inside the wording was a detail no one paid attention to at the time. Most buildings never use all the space they're allowed to build. A church that could legally be 20 stories might only be 3. A small store might only take up a fraction of its legally permitted size. Those unused vertical feet, the potential above the building, stayed untouched. But legally, they still existed. Developers began to realize something extraordinary. If they could buy that unused vertical space from a neighbor, they could add it to their own building. And that's when an invisible asset took on a name powerful enough to reshape a skyline: air rights. To the average person, it sounds ridiculous. Buying air. But to developers, it was like discovering a cheat code to the city. Suddenly, the frantic hunt began. Developers walked through Midtown with one goal: to buy every square foot of unused air they could get their hands on. They made quiet offers to churches. They made discreet deals with private clubs. They met with the owners of tiny old buildings sandwiched between modern offices. Some negotiations took years, some took minutes. These small buildings, forgotten by time, ignored by tourists, too old to attract tenants, became treasure chests. Not because of the bricks inside them, but because of the sky above them. Air rights began selling for tens of millions, then hundreds of millions. Developers stitched parcel after parcel together, assembling invisible jigsaw pieces until they had enough volume to build something the city was never designed for: a super tall skyscraper on a piece of land barely wider than a townhouse. No laws were broken, no regulations were violated. They simply used a loophole so obscure that no one imagined it could be pushed this far. And once developers gathered enough air rights, they unlocked a terrifying, exhilarating freedom. They could build as high as physics and their bank accounts allowed. Why? Because billionaires weren't buying homes, they were buying views. The higher the apartment, the higher the price. Every foot of altitude could mean another $1 million. Every floor added could mean tens of millions more. So they kept climbing, upward, 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 until the buildings became so thin they looked impossible from the street below. This wasn't natural growth. This wasn't organic development. This wasn't the city evolving on its own. It was a legal hack, a loophole transformed into a skyscraper factory. This wasn't even the most extreme challenge. Because after developers bought the air, after they broke the height limits, after they unlocked the sky, they faced a far more terrifying problem. How do you build something so tall and so thin that it doesn't sway like a giant diving board when the wind pushes against it? That part of the story, the physics, the risk, the engineering nightmare, is where things get truly astonishing. Once developers had gathered enough invisible air to push their towers into the clouds, a new kind of challenge appeared. One no lawyer, no banker, and no zoning loophole could solve. They had the right to build higher, but not the ability. because what they wanted to create didn't exist anywhere in the conventional world of architecture. These weren't normal skyscrapers. They weren't even super talls in the classic sense. They were something far stranger and far more dangerous, towers so tall and so thin that they seemed to defy physics itself. Imagine a building rising more than 1,000 feet, yet narrow enough that it would practically disappear if you turned it sideways. A structure stretched upward like a needle pressed into the sky. No broad base. No massive footprint. Just height, pure, unapologetic height. And with height came the enemy engineers feared most, the wind. Wind is invisible, but on a skyscraper this thin, it behaves like a giant hand pushing against the walls. A gentle breeze becomes a shove, a storm becomes a threat, a hurricane, unthinkable. On a typical skyscraper, the width keeps it stable. On a pencil tower, the width is nearly non-existent. It's like balancing a ruler vertically on your fingertip. It wants to sway, bend, move. And here's the unsettling truth. People living tens of stories above the ground can feel that movement. Doors rattle, pictures shake, water in glasses ripples, elevators vibrate, entire floors subtly drift side to side, sometimes by several inches. You don't see the building move from the outside, but on the inside, your body feels it. Residents describe it as standing on a boat that never stops rocking. So how do you stop a skyscraper from making billionaires seasick? With one of the strangest pieces of engineering ever installed inside a luxury tower, a giant, swinging, multi-hundred-ton block of steel. It's called a tuned mass damper, but to the people who build these towers, it's more like the skyscraper's secret heart. A creature that never sleeps, never stops moving, and exists for one purpose, to fight the wind. When the building sways one way, the damper swings the other, balancing the motion like a massive counterweight suspended in the sky. It is silent. It is hidden. It is absolutely essential. Without it, these buildings wouldn't just be uncomfortable, they would be unlivable. But even with the damper, engineers had to reinforce these towers in ways no one had ever done before. The core of each building, the vertical spine, had to be made from concrete so dense and so strong that it could withstand forces no other residential tower in the world had ever faced. This wasn't home building. This was aerospace engineering turned vertical. At 432 Park Avenue, the iconic grid you see from miles away isn't just a design. Those massive square openings are part of the structural skeleton, designed to break the wind's grip on the tower. At 101 West 57th Street, one of the thinnest skyscrapers ever constructed, the facade is reinforced with terracotta panels and bronze trusses that act like the ribs of a gigantic spine. Flexible enough to breathe with the wind, strong enough to stand against it. Even the construction process was extreme. Concrete had to be pumped hundreds of feet upward without hardening inside the pipes. Steel beams had to be lifted into place with pinpoint precision in winds that could sway a crane like a pendulum. Windows had to be engineered to survive hurricane-level pressure hundreds of feet above the ground. Every inch of every tower was a battle, against gravity, against weather, against physics itself. But despite all the innovation, all the engineering brilliance, all the billion-dollar problem-solving, there was one thing no one expected, that once people finally moved into these sky palaces, the problems were only just beginning. Because engineering can protect the building, but it can't always protect the people inside it. And the higher these towers climbed, the more cracks began to appear, not in the structures, but in the illusion. For all the brilliance behind these towers, for all the engineering wizardry, the billion-dollar marketing, the sleek brochures promising perfection in the clouds, something unsettling began to happen once people actually moved in. A truth whispered at first, then leaked into the news, and finally exploded into lawsuits. These luxury palaces weren't as perfect as they looked. And in some cases, they weren't even functional. The first warning sign appeared not in a courtroom, but in the sky itself. Residents in nearby buildings began to notice something strange night after night. Floors of these new towers stayed completely dark. Not a single light, not a single silhouette, not a single trace of life. Imagine looking up at a 1,400-foot building, a vertical city suspended in the sky, and seeing nothing but darkness. It wasn't a blackout. It wasn't coincidence. It was the truth these towers were built on. They were designed to be empty. Many buyers weren't moving into their units. They weren't furnishing them. Some never even visited them. To them, a 20 million condo wasn't a home. It was an investment vehicle, a vault made of glass, a place to park wealth, not to live. But the residents who did choose to move into these sky palaces, they discovered a nightmare hidden behind the marble floors and panoramic windows. The loudest cries came from 432 Park Avenue. the elegant white grid rising above Midtown like a minimalist monument. From the outside, it looked flawless. Inside, it was anything but. One stormy night, residents heard noises they couldn't explain. Deep, guttural moans echoing through the hallways, metallic groans vibrating against walls, a strange, low rumble that rolled through the building like a living creature. They didn't know it at the time, but they were hearing the tower itself bending in the wind. Days later, elevators began to malfunction. Not minor delays, complete shutdowns. People were trapped inside metal boxes 70, 80 floors above the ground for long, terrifying stretches of time. Then came the leaks. Massive, furious torrents of water burst through pipes on high floors, spilling downward through dozens of apartments, destroying tens of millions of dollars in interiors. One leak reportedly cascaded from the 60th floor all the way down like a vertical waterfall, knocking out elevators, flooding hallways, and leaving residents furious and helpless. Walls cracked, ceilings separated, doors warped, floorboards buckled. Even the trash chute, a simple, ordinary system, exploded with such force that one resident described the sound as a bomb going off. And this wasn't rumor. This wasn't exaggeration. These complaints turned into a lawsuit so massive, so detailed, so shocking that it became international news. Millions of dollars in damages, hundreds of alleged defects, accusations of concealed engineering problems, buyers claiming they were deceived into purchasing luxury units that behaved like unstable ships at sea. And here's the most ironic part. These towers were built for billionaires, people with power, people used to perfection, people who don't tolerate inconvenience, let alone structural chaos. If the ultra-rich were complaining this loudly, you knew the problems were real. And once the illusion cracked of 432 Park Avenue, people began looking more closely at the other towers too. Many of them were nearly empty. Some floors had never been lived in. Prices quietly dropped. Units resold at losses. Marketing teams shifted strategies. Concierge desks saw more lawyers than residents. The dream of Sky Palace living was showing its flaws. Because engineering can solve wind, but it cannot solve greed, and architecture can reach the clouds, but it cannot escape the truth. These towers were built for money, not for people. And the city was beginning to feel the consequences, not just in the towers themselves, but in the shadows they cast over the lives of millions below. As these towering needles pierced the clouds, another force began rising beneath them, something far more emotional, far more human, and far more explosive than any engineering issue. Anger. Not from billionaires, not from investors, but from the millions of ordinary New Yorkers who lived in the shadows, literally, because these towers weren't just tall. They cast shadows that stretched for more than a mile into Central Park, shadows that moved across the grass like dark, drifting glaciers. Walk through the park on a winter afternoon and the change is unmistakable. You feel the sudden drop in temperature. You see patches of landscape swallowed in cold, moving darkness. Playgrounds dim, benches fall into shadow, ice rinks turn colder. And parents notice their children shivering in areas that used to be warm. These weren't the gentle, natural shadows of trees. They were knife-like silhouettes, long, sharp, and mechanical, thrown across the city by pencil-thin towers built for people who almost never stepped foot inside them. The debate erupted immediately. Who owns the sky? Who gets the sunlight? Dozens of community groups staged protests demanding answers. They argued that public spaces, the places all New Yorkers share, were being altered to serve a tiny handful of billionaires who would barely ever show up. It was the ultimate irony. A skyline designed for the richest people on Earth was now affecting the lives of the people who could never afford even the cheapest apartment in these towers. But the shadows weren't the only source of outrage. Urban planners began to uncover something even more outrageous, a second loophole that developers had been using right under the city's nose: mechanical voids. A harmless-sounding term for something far more cunning. Zoning laws allow mechanical floors, spaces filled with HVAC equipment, wiring, pumps, and machinery, to be exempt from height limits. Every building needs mechanical floors, so the rule made sense. But the developers of Billionaires Row saw opportunity where others saw necessity. They didn't build small mechanical floors. They built massive ones, 100 feet tall, sometimes nearly the size of an entire regular apartment stack. And most of these floors were empty. Not because they needed the space, but because by adding these colossal voids, they could push the luxury apartments higher into the sky, higher above neighboring rooftops, higher above the competition, and higher above Central Park. Because the higher the floor, the higher the price. What was supposed to be a structural necessity became an architectural trick. City officials described it as a nakedly manipulative way to cheat height regulations. Residents saw it as a violation of trust. Critics called it daylight robbery, literally. By the time the city closed the loophole, the towers were already built, already casting shadows, already stretching their luxury floors into the clouds. The damage was done. And the anger spread beyond zoning experts and urban activists. It spread to everyday New Yorkers watching their rent climb higher and higher. It spread to small business owners pushed out by landlords chasing billionaire row price tags. It spread to generations of families who no longer recognized the neighborhood they grew up in. Because while these towers rose higher, the rest of the city struggled. Middle-income residents were forced outward. Affordable housing dwindled. Long-time shops closed. Whole blocks changed character overnight. And the new ultra-rich residents who bought these sky mansions, they weren't around to notice. Most of them never moved in. Some never visited at all. Doormen watched empty lobbies night after night. Concierge desks sat quiet. Mailboxes remained unopened. Entire floors never turned on their lights. The neighborhood gained wealth, but lost life. And that's what truly ignited the fury. New York's skyline had always been a symbol of opportunity, but now it was becoming a symbol of exclusion, a symbol of height without humanity. The towers stood tall, breathtaking, shimmering, but empty on the inside, beautiful and hollow. And the people living beneath them? They were left to ask a question that cut deeper than any shadow. If the city keeps building for people who aren't here, what happens to the people who are? For nearly a decade, Billionaires Row felt unstoppable. A golden escalator rising into the clouds, driven by global wealth, engineering miracles, and loopholes sharp enough to cut through every regulation in its path. But no boom lasts forever. And slowly, quietly, the first cracks began to appear. It didn't happen overnight. There was no single headline that broke the illusion. Instead, it was a subtle shift, a slow cooling, like the end of a fever dream. The luxury market that once dominated Manhattan began to change. Buyers who once rushed into sky mansions started to hesitate. The frenzy faded. Part of this shift was embarrassment. The problems inside 432 Park Avenue, the leaks, the elevator failures, the strange groaning sounds became international news. Billionaires don't like being associated with malfunctioning engineering experiments. They crave prestige, not lawsuits. Suddenly, the idea of living 80 floors above Manhattan wasn't glamorous. It seemed risky. And when the elite lose confidence, they leave quietly. Without warning, without debate, without nostalgia. Their money simply moves elsewhere. But the market had another problem: oversupply. Developers had spent years building homes for the world's richest 0.1%, imagining endless demand at 20 million, 50 million, even 100 million a unit. But the ultra-rich are a tiny group, and even they don't buy endless homes in the clouds. One by one, the towers filled with unsold units. Real estate firms whispered about softness in the market, a polite way of admitting that prices were dropping. Meanwhile, global economics shifted. China tightened its capital controls. Countries cracked down on offshore accounts. Sanctions froze questionable wealth. Interest rates rose. Investors became cautious. Money that once poured into New York like a river suddenly trickled, thin, hesitant, uncertain. Some towers saw units resell at dramatic losses. Buyers who once bragged about breaking price records were now quietly selling at discounts, hoping no one would notice. Other buildings still held strong, especially 220 Central Park South, which embraced a classic design and solid engineering. Its prices rose. Its sales remained steady. And that contrast revealed a truth developers never expected. The ultra-rich didn't want experiments. They wanted certainty. The pencil towers, bold, thin, futuristic, had been built for spectacle. But the wealthy, it turned out, preferred stability over spectacle. The symbolism shifted. Being at the top of a thin super tall no longer meant exclusive. It meant unstable, loud, risky, unpredictable, and that shift rattled the entire market. Soon, fewer cranes dotted the midtown skyline. Developers who once bragged about their next sky palace began shelving their plans. Banks became wary of financing new towers. Foreign investors asked hard questions before wiring money. New York, for the first time in years, stopped reaching upward. But the slowdown revealed something deeper, something far more lasting than market trends. It revealed that Billionaires Row was never truly built for living. It was built for a moment in time, a moment shaped by global capital, engineering ambition, and the illusion that the sky itself could be sold like a commodity. Now that moment was fading. And what remained was uncertain. Would these ghost towers eventually fill with families? Would new wealth replace old wealth? Would the skyline settle or rise again? Or would these structures stand half empty for decades, monuments to a gilded age that came too fast and ended too quietly? The frenzy had ended. But the legacy? As the dust settled on the chaos, the lawsuits, the engineering marvels, and the financial disappointment, a bigger question began echoing through New York. Not in boardrooms or construction sites, but in classrooms, cafes, architecture studios, and late-night conversations. What exactly had this skyline become? A miracle, a warning, a triumph of ambition, or a symbol of everything gone wrong? The truth is complicated, because the legacy of Billionaires Row depends entirely on where you stand, on the street looking up, or in a penthouse looking down. From one angle, these towers are breathtaking, a testament to human ingenuity, the highest expression of structural daring. A glimpse of what happens when engineering is pushed to its absolute limit. 111 West 57th Street, for example. A tower so thin, so impossibly elegant, it looks like someone stretched a skyscraper upwards with a pair of hands. A structure 24 times taller than it is wide, a ratio unheard of in traditional architecture. Its very existence is a statement we can do the impossible, and there's no denying the talent behind these achievements. The tuned mass dampers, the super compressed concrete, the aerodynamic shaping. These innovations didn't just support the towers, they rewrote the rules of skyscraper design. They forced engineers to rethink what a building could be, how it could move, how it could stand. In that sense, Billionaires Row represents a new frontier. A chapter in architectural history that young engineers will study for decades. But architecture is not just engineering, it's culture, it's community, it's humanity, and from that angle, another angle entirely. The legacy of these towers becomes darker, because these towers weren't built for New Yorkers, not for families, not for workers, not for artists, teachers, or young professionals hoping for a future in the city. They were built for the ultra-rich, people who often weren't even here, people who saw New York not as home but as a vault, a safe, stable place to park wealth. And what does it mean for a city when its most visible structures are built for people who don't live there? The answer is uncomfortable. It means neighborhoods lose their soul. It means middle-class residents are pushed outward. It means the skyline becomes a mirror of inequality, a place where height reflects privilege more than progress. And as these towers rose, the city felt the consequences. Rent climbed, shops closed, housing shortages worsened. The middle class thinned, workers commuted longer. Small businesses got replaced by high-end boutiques. The surrounding streets felt more corporate, less local. At the same time, the towers cast literal shadows long enough to stretch across Central Park, dimming the very public spaces millions depend on. A skyline that once symbolized opportunity began to symbolize separation. But perhaps the most telling part of the legacy is the quiet recognition that these towers didn't happen accidentally. They happened because the system allowed them, or even encouraged them. Zoning loopholes, mechanical void tricks, political silence, developers who learned to bend rules, not break them, a city that didn't stop them until it was too late. Billionaires Row is the product of decisions. Small decisions, legal decisions, economic decisions, made quietly over decades. And now the city must decide what comes next. Will these towers one day be admired like the Empire State Building, monuments of a bold era of engineering? Or will they be viewed like relics of excess, symbols of a time when cities prioritized wealth over community? Maybe both, maybe neither. The truth is still unfolding. Because a skyline doesn't reveal its meaning immediately. Time assigns value. Time decides legacy. Time reveals what was ambition and what was arrogance. For now, the towers stand, immense, thin, shimmering, controversial, frozen in a moment where money, engineering, and ambition collided. What they mean is still being written. While the world stared upward at the glittering tops of Billionaires Row, mesmerized by their height and engineering, something else was happening far below. Something quieter, more intimate, and far more important. A different story was unfolding at street level, a story not about steel and glass, but about people. The rise of these towers didn't just reshape the skyline, it reshaped the lives of everyone living in their shadow. Because underneath the billion-dollar penthouses, beneath the lofty terraces no resident ever stepped onto, beneath the shimmering slabs of reflective glass, real New Yorkers were being squeezed out, one block at a time. Rents surged, legacy businesses vanished, neighborhood culture dissolved like smoke in the wind. Families who'd lived around Midtown for decades suddenly found themselves priced out of their own streets. A corner deli that had served coffee and bagels for 40 years closed after its rent tripled, the landlord hoping to lease the space to a luxury brand that never arrived. A dry cleaner shut down because the building it occupied was earmarked for air right transfers. Entire blocks that once buzzed with middle-class life became lined with dark lobbies and silent entrances belonging to people who weren't even there. And that emptiness crept into the psychology of the city. Because a skyline isn't just architecture, it's identity. It tells the people who live beneath it what a city stands for, who it represents, who belongs. Billionaires Row sent a new kind of message. This city is for someone richer than you. It wasn't intentional, but it was felt. A jogger running along Central Park South would look up at the towers and feel small, not just in size, but in significance. A barista serving coffees nearby would watch young professionals rush by and wonder how much longer they could afford the neighborhood. A family walking home from school would notice the shadows darkening parts of the park that once glowed warm in the afternoon sun. These towers weren't hostile, they were indifferent. And sometimes indifference hurts more than arrogance. Meanwhile, inside the towers themselves, another group of people lived an entirely different reality. The workers, doormen, concierges, cleaners, handymen, window washers suspended on ropes hundreds of feet in the air, maintenance crews who navigated hidden corridors and service elevators that the public never sees. These workers knew the truth of the towers better than anyone. They saw the empty hallways, the uncollected mail, the penthouses that never turned on a single light. One doorman claimed he could work a full shift without seeing a single resident. Only assistants, security contractors, and property managers checking in on behalf of absent owners. Another said, it's like working in a palace built for ghosts. They kept the buildings running, kept the illusion alive, but they also saw the loneliness behind the luxury. And outside, the city felt the consequences. The middle class drifted outward. Younger generations struggled to imagine a future in the city. Beloved small businesses were replaced with empty storefronts waiting for tenants who never arrived. Manhattan, the beating heart of possibility, felt like it was becoming a marketplace for global wealth rather than a place shaped by the people who lived there. That was the real cost of Billionaires Row, not the shadows, not the engineering flaws, not even the empty homes. It was the erosion of a feeling that New York once gave freely, the belief that this city belonged to everyone who worked hard enough to be part of it. And as the towers continued rising, as the empty windows reflected the sunset like cold mirrors, the question grew louder in the hearts of millions. What happens to a city when the tallest buildings in it aren't built for the people who live there, but for the money passing over their heads? In the end, Billionaires Row is far more than a collection of skyscrapers. It is a lens, a magnifying glass held up to the soul of a city, revealing what happens when the invisible forces of wealth outgrow the visible needs of the people who live beneath them. These towers rise like monuments to ambition. They are bold. They are breathtaking. They are feats of engineering that pushed human limits and forced architects to rewrite the very rules of gravity. But they are also warnings carved into the sky. Warnings about inequality, about loopholes, about policies built with good intentions twisted into tools for profit. Warnings about what happens when a city forgets that its skyline is not just a symbol of power, but a responsibility. Because behind every shimmering pane of glass, there's a choice that was made, a choice about who the city belongs to, a choice about what and who rises and what gets left in the shadow. Billionaires Row stands as a reminder that cities are living things. They breathe, they change, they adapt, but they also remember. They remember the families pushed farther from the center. They remember the parks that lost their sunlight. They remember the local shops replaced with empty, silent lobbies. They remember the workers who kept these ghost towers running even when no one lived inside them. And they remember the moment when the skyline began to reflect not the dreams of the people, but the ambitions of the wealthy. These buildings will stand for decades, maybe centuries. They will glitter at sunset. They will dominate postcards. They will impress tourists. They will fascinate architects. But the legacy they leave behind won't be written in steel or concrete. It will be written in the choices we make next. Do we continue building cities for investors, or do we reclaim cities for the communities that give them life? Do we let loopholes decide the future? Or do we design skylines that serve everyone? Because a skyline isn't just a view, it's a message. It tells the world who we are and who we hope to become. And if Billionaires Row teaches us anything, it's that the sky may not belong to anyone, but the city beneath it belongs to all of us. In the end, Billionaires Row is far more than a collection of skyscrapers. It is a lens, a magnifying glass held up to the soul of a city, revealing what happens when the invisible forces of wealth outgrow the visible needs of the people who live beneath them. These towers rise like monuments to ambition. They are bold. They are breathtaking. They are feats of engineering that pushed human limits and forced architects to rewrite the very rules of gravity. But they are also warnings carved into the sky. Warnings about inequality, about loopholes, about policies built with good intentions twisted into tools for profit. Warnings about what happens when a city forgets that its skyline is not just a symbol of power, but a responsibility. Because behind every shimmering pane of glass, there's a choice that was made, a choice about who the city belongs to, a choice about what and who rises and what gets left in the shadow. Billionaires Row stands as a reminder that cities are living things. They breathe, they change, they adapt, but they also remember. They remember the families pushed farther from the center. They remember the parks that lost their sunlight. They remember the local shops replaced with empty, silent lobbies. They remember the workers who kept these ghost towers running even when no one lived inside them. And they remember the moment when the skyline began to reflect not the dreams of the people, but the ambitions of the wealthy. These buildings will stand for decades, maybe centuries. They will glitter at sunset. They will dominate postcards. They will impress tourists. They will fascinate architects. But the legacy they leave behind won't be written in steel or concrete. It will be written in the choices we make next. Do we continue building cities for investors, or do we reclaim cities for the communities that give them life? Do we let loopholes decide the future? Or do we design skylines that serve everyone? Because a skyline isn't just a view, it's a message. It tells the world who we are and who we hope to become. And if Billionaires Row teaches us anything, it's that the sky may not belong to anyone, but the city beneath it belongs to all of us.